Greetings, traveler. I bid you listen closely and enjoy what is to come.
On a cold morning in September 1939, the skies over Poland were filled with the thunderous sounds of German fighter planes, the flashes of light from cannons, and the barrage of machine gun bullets that rained down on the cities in an instant, shattering the calm that had been fragile until now. The rapidly advancing panzers crushed the cobbled streets, while the German armed forces advanced with impeccable discipline. In a matter of days, poor Poland fell into the grip of terrible power. That is how the bloodiest war in human history began, called World War II. From that day on, for the next 6 years, the world would witness destruction on an unprecedented scale. Cities that had just risen from the destruction of World War I soon turned back to ashes, and human civilization reached its lowest point. However, from that destruction, a new world order was born, forming the modern civilization that we know today. World War II cannot be separated from the dark tragedy of World War I, which occurred 2 decades earlier. World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, and should have been the war that ended all wars, instead became a kind of introduction to a much more brutal and terrible war. World War I involved the big countries in Europe, a bloody battle with millions of soldiers dying on the battlefield, the brutal trenches. Only when the dust of war had settled and a peace treaty had been agreed upon, the world, instead of finding lasting peace, instead of sowing the seeds for the next war. It all started from the 1919 treaty, which ended the World War that day in a large room attended by diplomats from all over the world. The German delegation seemed to sit in silence while the England, France, and the United States, who won the war and became the great powers in this conference, wanted to destroy Germany as completely as possible. France, whose land was destroyed by the war, wanted revenge and wanted to weaken Germany forever. Then England ensured that Germany would never again be in, but also did not want to completely destroy them, while the United States, under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson, preferred a peaceful approach with Wilson's 14 points, which contained the concept of the League of Nations and world peace. But in the end, the dominant French voice completely destroyed the German state. On June 28, 1919, the German delegation was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which contained 440 articles, which regulates various severe punishments. Some of the points of the agreement are that Germany was forced to admit and accept full responsibility for the war, which was then used as the basis for a demand for very large compensation. Germany was required to pay war reparations of 132 billion Met gold, or around hundreds of billions of dollars today, which then destroyed the German economy and caused very severe inflation. In addition, the German military was also limited to only 100,000 soldiers, without an air force, large warships, or tanks, which made it almost helpless. Germany also had to lose some of its territories and had to be handed over to France. The Saar region was placed under the administration of the League of Nations. Poland got West Prussia, so that Germany was separated from the province of East Prussia by the Polish corridor. As a result, Germany lost 13% of its territory and about 10% of its population. As a result, the large burden of reparations that had to be borne by Germany caused hyperinflation. In the early 1920s, German money became worthless. People suffered from hunger, and trust in the government dropped sharply. At that time, the price of bread, which in 1921 was only 4 mark, in 1923 jumped to 200 billion mark. This condition made German citizens have to carry carts full of paper money just to buy daily food. Not a few of them even burned piles of money just to keep themselves warm. The life savings of the German people were destroyed overnight for the German people. The Agreement Versailles. Not only an insult, but also a punishment that is too cruel. Their economy was destroyed. Their self-esteem was trampled, and anger began to burn in their hearts. The sight of people starving, mass unemployment, and economic destruction instilled deep anger towards the Versailles Agreement and the countries that drafted it. And unfortunately, a young war veteran with a square mustache who was at that time trying to rebuild his life also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache who was at that time trying to rebuild his life also felt this humiliation. The square mustache who was at that time trying to rebuild his life also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache who was at that time trying to rebuild his life also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache who was at that time trying to rebuild his life also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with a square mustache, who was at that time trying to rebuild his life, also felt this humiliation. The young man with the square mustache named Adolf Hitler. He was one of the people who felt the most impact of the Versfeld Agreement. As a World War I veteran, he underwent war training, and he could not accept the humiliation given to his country. So in 1919, he joined the German workers, who then became a Nazi. Hitler used biased propaganda to convey the same message that aroused the emotions of the German people. Secondly, Jews and communists were the main causes of the destruction of Germany. And thirdly, Germany had to rebuild. His glory in expanding his territory in 1923, despair due to the ruined economy, Hitler tried to carry out a coup in Moon, which was known as Bir al-Nam. This coup failed completely, and Hitler ended up in prison. However, while in prison, Hitler actually wrote Mein Kampf, a book which became the Nazi Manifesto. In this book, he wrote his vision of destroying the Treaty of Versailles, expelling the Jews from Germany, and conquering the territory in the east for the Aryans. And when he was finally released, Hitler devised a new strategy, not seizing power by force, but through the political system. In the midst of this political tension, the world was hit by the Great Depression of 1929, a global economic crisis that caused financial ruin in many countries. America, England, and France tried hard to restore their economies, while the German people were increasingly sinking into ruin. However, Germany used this crisis as an excuse to accelerate militarization when the existing political parties failed to provide a solution. Hitler and the Nazis concretely offered something new, namely a revival for Germany. Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933 with the promise of restoring Germany's glory. Menaech promised a living space for the Aryan people with clever propaganda and brutal oppression of his political opponents. Hitler quickly transformed Germany into a totalitarian state with rapidly growing military power. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had already pioneered the ideology of fascism, a system, the government that prioritizes the absolute power of the state and militarism of Italy, although not as strong as Germany, also has its own imperialist ambitions, especially in the African region and then in the East. Japan has developed into an aggressive military power that has ambitions to control the Asia-Pacific. The invasion of Curacao in 1931 and then all of China in 1937 shows Japan's determination to build a large empire in Asia. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, also adopted a totalitarian government in a form of communism, although with a different vision from fascism besides carrying out large-scale industrialization and brutal political cleansing to maintain its power. The world is now divided into blocs that are suspicious of each other. On one side, there are democratic countries such as England, France, and the United States. On the other side, there is Nazi Germany with a burning grudge, fascist Italy, and aggressive Japan. Then the Soviet Union is in the middle with its communist ideology, which is also suspected by both sides. When Hitler began to establish his influence in Germany, he began to openly violate the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler rebuilt the German armed forces, introduced compulsory military service, and even sent troops to Rhineland, a region that should have been a military-free zone. At that time, the world could only watch without doing much because most countries wanted to avoid another war after the horrors of World War I. However, Hitler's actions did not stop there. In 1938, he annexed Austria. Angelus incident, and a year later he demanded the Sudetenland region from Czechoslovakia, and instead of opposing England and France, chose the path of peace by giving in to the Munich Agreement, hoping that Hitler would be satisfied, and thus war could be avoided. Unfortunately, England and France's suspicions were very wrong, because not long after that, Hitler ignited the flames of war that could not be extinguished that morning, September 1st, 1939. The sky above Poland thundered brutally from a distance. The sound of the roar. The sound of tank destroyers and cannons booming sounded like an approaching storm. German troops with extraordinary discipline surged forward with full force. They carried out the Blitzkrieg strategy, a lightning war that relied on speed, surprise, and coordination of air and ground attacks that were very deadly from the sky. Luftwaffe bombers dropped bombs on Polish cities, destroying various important infrastructures and making civilians panic, running in an instant. The streets were filled with debris and screams. Fear echoed in the air, while on the ground the Polish troops were moving quickly. The Polish troops were outgunned and outnumbered on the other side of the east. The Soviet Union also moved in accordance with the secret agreement of the Molotov Pact between Stalin and Hitler. The Soviet Union also invaded Poland on September 17, 1939. Poland, caught between these two giant powers, had no chance of surviving. On September 27, 1939, Warsaw, the capital of Poland, fell, making this country surrender to the hands of Stalin and Hitler. The enemy at that time, the world was shocked to see how quickly Germany and the Soviet Union destroyed a country, and that was the beginning of the real destruction after Poland fell. Europe had plenty of time for Hitler, who was hungry for expansion, to start turning his attention to the West. England and France had declared war on Germany. Since the day after the German attack on Poland, they were still reluctant to take offensive steps. They preferred to stay on the border and wait for Germany's move. Next, a policy that would later be a big mistake in April of that year. Germany launched an attack on Denmark and Norway with extraordinary speed. Denmark surrendered in a matter of hours. Norway, which was more difficult to conquer, held out months before finally succumbing to Germany. But this was not enough, because the attack that music in 4 years, the Netherlands and France simultaneously using a blitzkrieg strategy that proved effective and deadly. Germany destroyed the Allied defenses in a short time. In less than 2 months, German troops succeeded in occupying France, so that on June the 21st of 1944, the German army occupied Paris, and the French government